Okay, now that we've been talking for a little while about neurons and how they function, what their anatomy is like, let's talk a little bit more about how we put those neurons together to create kind of the whole structure and function of the nervous system. And so far we've been talking about a particular style of neuron that has the dendrites, and then that's connected to the soma or the cell body, which then leads to the axon, then the axon terminal. And that's a particular kind of arrangement called a multipolar neuron. That's not how all neurons look. And what we have right here now is a different arrangement of neuron called a pseudo unipolar neuron. And what you'll see here now is that the soma, or the cell body, is off to one side. It's not directly in line with the axon that's right here. Also, you'll notice that has no dendrites, and then down here at the end we have the axon terminals. Now, this is a type of neuron conformation that often occurs in sensory type neurons, where you'd have some sort of sensor up here that is going to sense something like light or oxygen or some chemicals or something like that, and send down its signal down this axon towards the axon terminals. And then in this we have two particular kinds of axons, or two particular stretches of the axon. That which comes before the cell body, and that which comes after the cell body as well. This side out here is called the peripheral axon. That is on the sensory side of the axon. And then also on the terminal side of the axon, we also have what is the central axon. So this is just another kind of neuron that can oftentimes happen, or a different kind of configuration that happens sometimes in the nervous system, and we're going to be using them to illustrate some sort of things here in just a moment. So I wanted to kind of familiarize you with these types of neuron configurations. And really, if we think about this for a moment, this kind of neuron can really carry out most of the functioning of the nervous system. So if we imagine something like this, where we have a sensor out here, and it's going to sense something in the environment, and then this is going to synapse onto some sort of muscle fiber. What we can actually have here is most of the functioning of a nervous system in one single neuron, where we get some sort of sense of the environment, and then we can also get the reaction. But one big thing that we don't get out of this simple kind of arrangement is we don't get any sort of sensory integration. And so if we want to get some sort of sensory integration, some sort of information integration, so that the information coming in from the sensor can be put together with other information, we can kind of make decisions, so to speak, about that information, we need more than one neuron. So we need to be able to connect these neurons together to be able to get that sort of thing. Because right here, we just have one action potential that can move down that axon. There's no changing that information. It's just whatever got picked up out here gets passed along, coded somehow, but passed along. And so for that type of configuration, we need to start putting together neurons. Now this is really kind of getting back now to the basic organization of the nervous system. You will have information collected from some sort of sensor, which will then be passed along a neuron, passed to another neuron that will pass that along to a final neuron that will carry that back out away from the nervous system to some sort of effector. Like this muscle that we have right here. So we have particular names for these kinds of neurons. The neuron that's pulling in information, passing it towards the bulk or the rest of the nervous system, is what's known as an afferent neuron. This is bringing in information towards the other nervous system. Then we have a neuron that is neither an afferent neuron or the other kind of neuron that we'll talk about in a minute. It's connected both on the beginning and the end by other neurons, and this is what's known as an interneuron. this picks up information from other neurons and will pass it on to other neurons. So it's connected to neurons both before and behind. And then the final one, the type of neurons that will collect information from other neurons but then pass it on to some sort of effector are called efferent neurons. And so these are the three main types of neurons that you are having in your central nervous system. And this is the kind of, at the very most rudimentary scale, the kind of organization that we have in the nervous system. We have afferents that pick up information, pass them on to interneurons, which will do some sort of integrating of that information, and then efferent neurons that'll take that integrated information and then pass it back out to an effector that we can then do something about the sensory information that we came back with. Okay, so let's take one moment here just to pass one thing off. In humans, 90% of your neurons are these kind of neurons right here, interneurons. And so the vast majority of the neurons in you, that's what they are. Just kind of a little fact there before we move on. Okay, so let's talk about kind of the overarching organization of the nervous system now. And we'll come back to those specific kind of arrangements in a minute, but let's talk a minute about. So again, we're seeing this particular loop. What we have is we have afferents, which then pass the information into the interneurons, which are primarily housed in the brain and the spinal cord. And then those are going to pass on, or they're going to integrate that information and then pass that on to efferent neurons. They're going to take that information away from those interneurons and then try to cause some reaction or some response in the body. So here, just for a second here, let's draw a line right here. Really, we have two main divisions in our nervous system. We have the brain and spinal cord and some other things slightly associated with this, and that is what's known as the central nervous system. Then we also have the afferents, the efferents, and then all the divisions of the efferents that we're going to talk about in just a moment, and those are the peripheral nervous system. So that is really overall the entire, the major overarching arrangement of the nervous system is into those two major categories, with the central nervous system composed of the brain and the spinal cord, then the peripheral nervous system, which is the efferent and afferent divisions. Now, the afferent side is really going to be getting information from sensory neurons, but then also from visceral neurons as well. They're bringing information from organs and things like that, and bringing all that information together and passing that on through the brain and spinal cord. Now, it's a little bit more complicated on the efferent side, where information is leaving the central nervous system, but one primary division is what's known as the somatic division. These are also known as motor neurons, and these are really going out and carrying information to skeletal muscle. Now, these are the kinds of neurons that are carrying the information for you to move your muscles, move around, kind of move your body around, to talk, to do whatever you really want to do. But that's not the only division of the efferent nervous system. We also have this division called the autonomic nervous system. Now, this is really the kinds of responses that have a lot more to do with organ function, other things like that. It used to be called the involuntary nervous system, while the somatic was called the voluntary. And it's really not a very good description. There's a lot of things in the somatic side that aren't actually voluntary, and there may or may not be some things in the autonomic that may be voluntary. Anyways, it's not a very good description, but the autonomic is more organ function and smooth muscle, heart function, things that you tend not to think about. Inside there, we have two different divisions, or three different divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system, which tends to mediate fight or flight responses, or kind of the responses that you need to mobilize if you need to actually get a lot of work out of your body. Running away from a bear, playing a football game, playing a volleyball game, other types of things that are going to require a lot of use of energy and a high level of activity from your body all at once. So we're kind of mobilizing all of our resources to do something. We also have the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, and these tend to be what are called rest and relax kinds of functions. So these are the kinds of things that we do when we're not needing to mobilize a big response from our body. Things like digestion, things like healing responses, or other stuff like this. Things that you do that are kind of maintenance when you don't need to do other big things. And then we also have the enteric nervous system, which tends to control things in the gut. And actually, this is a really interesting division of the nervous system. There's a lot of stuff going on here, but really in this class, we're not going to talk much about it, but really there could be an entire class just on the enteric nervous system. A lot of really interesting things going on. But I really want to just bring your attention back here. The sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, these are very, very important for controlling physiological functions. There's a lot of functions in physiology that overlap. The physiology of these systems are going to have a lot of control over the physiology of everything else going on in your body. We're going to talk about them again and again and again for the rest of the quarter. And so just kind of store that away for the moment. Okay, so let's just go ahead and recap a little bit about what we were talking about with these, and just kind of talk about where our nervous system would fall off. So if I draw a line right here, the central nervous system actually does not make a very clean break between afferent and efferent neurons. It turns out that the axon terminals, all of the interneurons, and the cell bodies of the efferent neurons are all in the central nervous system. Whereas the portions, the sensory portions of the afferent neurons and the axon terminals and the axons of the efferent neurons are in the peripheral nervous system. So, peripheral. Yeah, I spelled that right. So really, this is not a really clean break that all afferent neurons are totally in the peripheral nervous system. All interneurons are the only thing in the central nervous system. It's a little bit more complicated than that, because many of these axons right here are extending into things like the spinal cord, into the brain. A lot of these cell bodies down here, the efferent neurons, are actually in the spinal cord, or some of them are actually in your brain. So these are technically part of the central nervous system. So let's just go back and recap really quickly what's going on with the efferent peripheral nervous system. Just that side that's carrying things away from the central nervous system. And again, we have our somatic domain of that, which is motor neurons, which are carrying information to skeletal muscles. This is the end of the peripheral system that you use to move your body around. This is generally what's thought of as being under conscious control in humans. And then we also have the autonomic nervous system, which innervates a lot of the non-motor organs, a lot of things that aren't moving you around. And we have two divisions in there. The sympathetic, which again are fight or flight, and then the sympathetic nervous system, which tends to be rest and relax types of functions. And then finally, again, the enteric nervous system, which is really controlling a lot of the digestive system and what's happening on there. Sometimes it's said that your stomach has its own brain. Again, I wish I had more time to expound the enteric nervous system. Really interesting stuff going on there. Okay, so just to kind of give you some ideas of what kinds of things the sympathetic nervous system are doing in fight or flight. Just a recap on this a little bit is some of the responses would be a sympathetic nervous system can increase your heart rate. It will cause vasoconstriction. This is actually the constriction of blood vessels. This is going to help blood move more efficiently and more quickly to your skeletal muscles, things like this. Also, open up your bronchioles. Your bronchioles being the tubes into your lungs, for lack of a better term at the moment, and that's really going to help you draw more air into your lungs. All of these things mobilizing you for action, trying to get your body ready to do something very active. And the parasympathetic nervous system basically does the opposite of this, is going to tend to decrease your heart rate, cause vasodilation, tend to close off your bronchioles. And so that's kind of just to give you another idea of what's happening with the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so again, let's come back to this basic model of what's happening with the nervous system, where we have an efferent neuron that synapses onto an interneuron that then synapses onto an effector neuron or an efferent neuron that will then give you the action that you want. And it gets more complicated when we're talking about the autonomic nervous system. In particular here, the big thing here is that we're going to have these two neurons on the efferent side. So again, here we have an afferent side that's largely the same and an interneuron that's largely the same. We're not going to talk much about those because, again, that's not the efferent side. But here on the efferent side, we now have a two-neuron chain. And we have the axon of the first that then synapses onto the dendrites and the cell body of the second, which then go on to do the effect. Now, this synapse, this axon terminal and this cell body are going to occur within a structure called a ganglion. A ganglion is just this aggregation of cell bodies that is outside the central nervous system. And when you have this aggregation of cell bodies outside the central nervous system, it means that we have some limited information processing power here. There can actually be some integrating and divergence of information happening here. And we have names for the two different neurons. So here we have the neuron that's before the ganglion. This is the preganglionic neuron. And then we also have this neuron that's after. This is the postganglionic neuron. Yeah. Okay. Bad spelling. And so this is kind of the general structure of the autonomic nervous system, where we're going to have a ganglion that is sitting outside the central nervous system that this efferent side is going to pass through. And we have this two-neuron chain, both the preganglionic and the postganglionic. Another thing that's just important to know about these postganglionic neurons is that at our axon terminals here, we have these swellings. And these terminals are not just like a single synapse onto the affected organ or the effector organ. It's going to have kind of these long branches that have these many swellings called varicosities. Let's see if I can spell it. Varicosities. And these are going to be swellings that each one of these now can release neurotransmitter onto the effector organ and have some sort of effect on it. And what this does is this means that we can have more widespread effects than a simple single axon terminal that's then synapsing onto whatever organ that we're talking about. So let's talk about those. Let's zoom in just for a few moments and talk specifically about the different neurotransmitters that are going to be used by the efferent nervous system. And the first one that we should talk about is acetylcholine, or sometimes just abbreviated as ACH. And the receptors that respond to acetylcholine we'll call cholinergic receptors. So if we're talking about cholinergic receptor, there's just a receptor that responds to acetylcholine. Pretty straightforward. Now, there's more than one type of cholinergic receptors. We have nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and these are because this responds to nicotine. And this is how one of the ways that they're originally studied is that we could actually excite these with nicotine. And these receptors tend to be excitatory. They actually tend to cause whatever response that we're looking for. And these will tend to bind and open non-specific cation channels. So we're going to open these cation channels. You're going to get a transfer of positive charges across a membrane, start to cause probably, in most cases, some sort of membrane depolarization. We also have nicotinic cholinergic receptors, muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Now, muscarinic cholinergic receptors respond to muscatine. muscatine, which is actually a toxin from mushrooms. This is hallucinogenic mushrooms, the toxin in them. And this muscatine, these muscarinic receptors tend to have, instead of this nonspecific cation channel, they have these G protein second messenger systems causing the effect with them instead. And so in this case, a slightly different action. It's going to be a slightly slower reaction as well. But we'll come back and just know that these are the two type of cholinergic receptors. We'll talk a lot more about these as the quarter goes on. Additionally, we also have norepinephrine. This is sometimes called noradrenaline, especially places outside the U.S. It tends in the U.S. to be called norepinephrine. And these receptors for this particular type of neurotransmitter are known as adrenergic, from adrenaline. Adrenergic receptors. And all of these are G protein second messenger. And there's going to be several types of these as well, but we're not going to use quite the same naming convention. We're going to use alphas and betas and subscripts here. So alpha 1 adrenergic receptors use an IP3 and a calcium second messenger system to achieve their response. And these tend to be excitatory. So they're going to cause or initiate a response, not dampen a response. We also have the alpha 2 adrenergic receptors. These inhibit cyclic AMP production. These tend to be inhibitory. And so alpha 2 adrenergic receptors tend to be inhibitory and inhibit cyclic AMP production. Then we also have beta 1. So again, alphas, now we're going to betas. Beta 1, cyclic AMP, these use a cyclic AMP second messenger. And again, like the alpha 1s, these tend to be excitatory. And we also have a beta 2, which again also use a cyclic AMP second messenger, and these tend to be inhibitory. So just one thing to kind of remind you of this, the things with subscript 1s tend to be excitatory, the things with subscript 2 tend to be inhibitory. So let's kind of look just for a moment how all of this stuff is organized, kind of coming away from the central nervous system. We're going to use this kind of convention now, this ball and a line and a cup, to kind of illustrate neurons. The ball being the neuron body, the line being the axon of that neuron, and then the cup being the axon terminal, or word synapsing onto another neuron, or another cell, And we have these two different kind of neurons that we're displaying here. We have parasympathetic neurons in blue, and then we also have sympathetic in red. Okay, so one place I'll just direct you for the moment is if you go to page 160 in your textbook, figure 5.7 lists a lot of the major autonomic nerves. It's a good idea for you to go just look through that and kind of familiarize yourself with what's going on there and what these different things are doing. We also have these tan spots out here, and these are just to represent ganglia that are operating here. So again, you'll notice that these ganglia are occurring where we have a cell body and an axon terminal outside the central nervous system. And then one thing also that I just want to point out here is that most of the sympathetic nerves are going to either be departing the central nervous system up here from essentially the brain, the lower areas of the brain, they're cranial nerves, or down at the very end, the sacral nerves down here, the sacral end of the nerve cord. And then also the sympathetic neurons are going to be departing the spinal cord through the thoracic and lumbar. So really just the main region of the nerve cord here as well. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. So we have this sympathetic neuron that's leaving the brain here, and right here it goes into this ganglion, synapses onto the postganglionic nerve in what's known as a terminal ganglia. Ganglion. And this is most of the sympathetic ganglia tend to be very close to the target organs, not very close to the nerve cord at all, very far away from those. And they're called, for that reason, terminal ganglia. The neurotransmitter that's going to be used in the ganglia of the parasympathetic nervous system is acetylcholine. Out here at the very end, this will be synapsing onto something like, imagine the heart or something else like that, and controlling that. The neurotransmitter used here at the very end of the sympathetic nervous system to affect whatever effector organ it's supposed to be doing something to is also going to be acetylcholine. So both the ganglionic and the terminal neurotransmitter is going to be acetylcholine in the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look here at the sympathetic nervous system. And what you'll notice here is that these are synapsing in a ganglia very close to the nerve cord. And this is what's known as the sympathetic chain ganglion. Oops, let's go back to that. Oh, go back there. There we go. Sympathetic chain ganglion. This is a ganglion that runs laterally along the nerve cord for quite a ways, and it's sitting very close to there. It has this very special name, the sympathetic chain ganglion. But not all of the sympathetic nerves actually synapse here in the sympathetic chain ganglion. Some of them pass through that and actually further out, and then they'll be in this outside ganglion, which is a collateral ganglion. So let's talk about what neurotransmitters are being used in both of these places by the sympathetic nervous system. Well, it turns out that here in both the ganglia for the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter being used there is acetylcholine. Big surprise. It's what we've been talking about all along. But at the terminal end, where we're actually synapsing onto the effector organ, the sympathetic nervous system is using norepinephrine as the neurotransmitter there. So at the very end, where it's affecting the actual effector organs, the sympathetic nervous system is using acetylcholine, while as the sympathetic nervous system is using norepinephrine. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about one last thing here, and that's dual innervation, or how these autonomic branches both work together to really help control physiology. And it turns out that nearly all organisms are controlled by the autonomic nervous system have both sympathetic and parasympathetic innervation into them. And why in the world would you do this? Well, it's because it allows this really nice, precise control. The analogy for this is gas and brake in a car. You can use just gas to speed up, and then you could let off the gas to slow down, but that's a really inefficient way to slow down. Instead, what is better is to be able to have a brake that'll slow you down much quicker, and that's how it really works, with the sympathetic essentially being the gas, and the parasympathetic being the brake that allows you to slow down these actions. Now, an interesting thing, both of these are usually active all the time. And this is what's known as the tone or the tonic activity. How much is just kind of basally working on any given organ. Now, the question isn't which one is working, it's really which one is dominant. Which one of these divisions of the autonomic nervous system is working dominantly at any given time, has the most activity, is giving the most signal. So which one is the dominant player in the response that's happening at any given time. Okay, so that's really wrapping up the parasympathetic nervous system. In the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the central nervous system, and that should be about it for today.